We're going to be talking today about sharing stories. And I want to begin with a story about telling stories. And it's one of these cases where it's an ending is written by the original author. We might choose to write a slightly different ending. This story comes from Elie Wiesel's The Gates of the Forest. And it is a retelling of a legend from Eastern Europe and from the Hasidic experience from which Wiesel himself comes. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light the fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Years later, when a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, "Master of the universe, listen. I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer." And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, another rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient." It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. The years passed. It fell to Rabbi Israel of Rizhin to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. "I am unable to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, and I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and this must be sufficient." And it was sufficient. Wiesel ends this, "God made man because he loves stories." We might say, people made gods because we love stories. What does it take to make a good story? Well, there are many features. Maybe we can brainstorm them together. What would be a feature of a good story if you were making the formula, the recipe for a good story? Or if you think of a good story that you've really liked, whether it was a novel or a movie, what were some of the pieces that made it particularly good for you? Go ahead, Bron, and then Judy, and then Bron.
I'm reading a book now, and you just can't put it down. You just want to know what happens next, whether it's a movie or a book. You just want to know what's going to happen at the end. That makes it for me. Either makes it or breaks it for me.
Okay, great. Bron?
Twist or surprise ending.
Okay, twist or surprise endings. Cindy?
Similarly, I enjoy when it's realistic but not predictable.
Okay, Victoria?
When I'm reading or listening to a book and either the narrator or a character says something that I just sort of stop and say, wow, that, like an observation, some kind of truth. And then I always find myself making a note of it. And I feel like that's part of really good writing. And if it blends in seamlessly, then that's really good, to me, really good writing. And I love that.
Right, you could read a philosophy book, but if you read it in a novel, then it comes out and it hits you differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Emma and Anthony.
I'm gonna take care of the clothes.
Well, I actually just read an article in The Atlantic about Little Women and that story, and how it has been for so long interpreted and loved, and the actuality of the writer, who, and some of us know, right, that she wrote under a pseudonym to make money for her family, and she wrote stories that were scary stories, and stories that were very fictionalized. And she actually said that she didn't like women or girls that much, but she wrote that story again to keep her family fed, because she became a successful writer. So it makes me wonder about stories and the background, what the intent of the author, an author like Louisa May Alcott that we assumed was telling the story from the heart, and she was in some ways, but just storytelling and interpretation, I think, are really tricky and interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Irene, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I would say when a writer paints a picture in his or her telling of a story, that opens up the excitement for me as a reader. I like, to really imagine and visualize what's really going on in the story if the author is able to do that.
Yeah, and I would say similarly in a movie, if they do a really striking job of framing images or juxtaposing colors and characters, some movies just have scenes that just jump out at you and you say, wow, that was a really well planned out, thought out, structured shot, and it really sticks with you. I remember, of all movies, in a James Bond movie, there's one scene where Bond has been being stalked by this other secret agent the whole movie, and he doesn't know it, but we know it. And so Bond is walking on the main platform of a train station, and the spy who's been following him is walking a few steps behind him, but on the train itself, but we can see him through the glass on the side of the train. And it's just this beautiful juxtaposition of the two of them walking with the train on the Orient Express with these beautiful glass windows. And I remember the first time I saw it, I said, wow, that is cinematographic genius at play. And of course, authors do this with words, but movies are storytelling and visual as well as writing. Other elements people might highlight, they might like comedy, they might like tension or conflict. Often a good story has some emotional pull to it. We identify with a character, we care about what happens to them. I find that when I'm reading stories or watching TV shows where I don't like any of the characters, I tend not to stick with it, even if it's well written, even if it's dramatic. If I have no connection to them, I don't know, I find it doesn't speak to me the same way. And also, I personally like to see characters develop. I like to see how they change over time, what their new responses are. Not just that they're the same from the beginning to the end, that to me doesn't make a good story. But after all, I'm in the business of hearing people's stories and hearing how they change. Every funeral, I'm hearing story after story of what somebody did and who they were and how they related to each other, and I'm trying to draw them out. So I like the people stories, and that's what speaks to me. So let's ask a sort of question before this question, and that is, why do you think evolutionarily people like stories? I mean, people have been telling stories for a long time. If you go back to the earliest cave paintings in Lascaux in France, they're painting a hunt. They're telling a visual story of something they did or that they want to do. And we've even found ancient carved objects of imaginary animals, a human body with an animal head on it that's never existed, but it was in someone's imagination and they made an object to reflect that. So why do you think it is that human beings tell stories? Yeah, I see Rich and then Bill.
I think a couple of reasons, and one is for entertainment.
Okay.
One is to be educated, maybe to maintain some historical value.
Okay, so sometimes you tell stories to remember the group history. You tell it in story form instead of just bullet points.
And carry on traditions, passing stories on, which you got from your background.
Sure. And Bill, go ahead.
Similarly, as Richard said, I would say stories are told to help explain the human environment because there's so much unknown, and so people created stories in order to maybe figure out their curiosity, come to about where do they stand in the world.
And sometimes those origin stories, like the origin story for the rainbow, or why we die, or why the giraffe has a long neck, I don't know that they were answering the question as much as making meaning out of it. You know, now it makes sense why the giraffe has a long neck. Whether or not that's actually how it happened, it's what we decided that we agree is in the past. It's not like they did research or investigation or science to discover those stories. They wrote the stories to make meaning out of it, whether or not it was actual factual history. It's a different category of thought, I think. So we have Emma and then Cindy.
I want, so my dad told a lot of stories because, you know, he survived the war. He was in camps and so on. I think some of the need, a human need is to explain, of course, and also to share and to immortalize in some ways, to encapsulate a story and pass it on and have something live on beyond, you know, human lifespan. So.
Sure. The idea of transmission, right? Yeah, Cindy, go ahead.
Stories connect us to each other, and humans are such social creatures. You know, whether it's growing up and listening to my great grandmother tell stories of her mom and her brothers and her grandparents, or, you know, watching Stephen Colbert tell the story of how he met his wife, which, if you haven't watched that video on YouTube, it's absolutely charming. You know, it's a way to make a connection with somebody that you might not otherwise have. You know, I've never met Stephen Colbert. I've never been in the same room as him or anything like that. I don't think I ever will, but I can listen to his story and still think about the story of when I met my husband, about, you know, other couples, other people I know, you know, who met their person, you know, and how that means. And so it connects us, I think, in ways that supersede all of the things that divide us.
And I think it works in that connection level on two sides. 1 second now. It connects us individually to other people, but also it creates group connections because groups share stories. You have group narratives or sort of the canonical stories of each group that are the cultural literacy that you need to be part of this community, this clan, this tribe, whatever the level is. Just like you have family stories that get told over and over again. And that's part of being part of the family. And when you marry into a family, you begin to hear those family stories from the new family that you've rejoined. So I think that the connection part of storytelling, I mean, people even speculate that gossip was a really evolutionary advantageous phenomenon because news spread faster. And then you could find out what's happening with other people in the group. Whether or not it's true, you can at least find out what's going on. So this is one of those cases where storytelling is another facet of that. So I have Al and then Victoria.
Yeah, I would say to that, it can also justify the unjustifiable. You know, the Torah has all sorts of people we've hated, and, you know, if it's justified, we can kill them.
So it helps. We'll put it this way. It articulates communal values. You know, here's why you should hate those people. Here's why we should love these people, because it's part of our founding story. And whether it's explaining natural phenomenon or explaining social phenomenon or, you know, look, the Hanukkah story is a great example of this. We're coming up on Hanukkah. I'll be talking about it next week. And the holiday starts very early in our general calendar this year. For many generations, people lit candles without having the story of the miracle of the lights. That isn't added to the holiday until several centuries after the Maccabees lived. Every other account contemporaneous or closer to them doesn't mention the miracle. It's not till the Talmud, several hundred years later, that story of the miracle of the lights shows up. But that's stuck because that kind of a story really appealed to people, and it had a message behind it. It said the point was not the military victory, the point was the miracle. The point was God, not the Maccabees. And that was a shift in focus from what the Maccabees designed, because for their holiday, it was them. They were the focus. But everybody, you know, creates their holidays in their own, and their stories in their own images. Victoria, please.
You can kind of tell how old storytelling is and how sort of this is how our brains have evolved over time, by how bonding it is to share a story with someone else. So it might be gossip, like you said, but just telling stories is a big bonding exercise, and we do it with our family, friends. And when I was thinking of all the books that I read my kids when they were younger, and how many of them, some of them are just really funny, or you want them to learn something about another way of seeing the world or some lesson. And there are just, I think, concepts that the way we think as humans, you are maybe more accessible through a good story. Like when we try to explain how you see it this way because you had this information and this person saw it this way, that's hard to understand. It's easier to tell the story of the people who have a blindfold and they're each touching a different part of the elephant, and they describe that part of the elephant and say, well, this is what an elephant feels like. So I think, this is like, this must be how we, it is more accessible. You can explain concepts that would be very abstract and difficult, especially for kids to get, but they become concrete when you can illustrate them in a good and memorable story.
Sure. Bill and Peggy, were you going to jump in and say something? No? Okay. I saw you unmuted. I didn't know if that was on purpose to talk. And Bron, please.
I might say that the human brain delights in recognition. Some have said that the human brain is a pattern finding machine. And what Victoria and Cindy were saying, that may be part of the connection that we feel, either connecting to something that we have experienced or our capacity for imagination. We can imagine experiencing what's in the story.
Yeah, and I think some stories actually are good for our emotional growth. Not just experiencing other cultures, but feeling feelings or thinking about things in new ways. Some of it's curiosity. We want to see what's possible. Stories aren't only about real things. There's imagination, there's fiction, and there's fantasy, and there's things that never were or have not yet come to be. And our curiosity for possibilities is part of what drives us. You can make a list of all the things in science fiction which have come to be, but were written about decades before, because people were imagining, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And then now we can. So in what format do you best like to experience stories? Do you prefer to read paper books? Do you read ebooks, Kindle books? Do you read articles on a website? Do you listen to an audiobook? Do you like storytelling performances? There's a famous podcast and radio show called The Moth, but there are plenty of other places to hear storytelling events, or movies or TV shows or stage plays, in that dramatized version of it. Or even just hearing someone tell a personal story over a dinner party or a Zoom call. Which is the format of story experiencing that you find connects with you? Judy, please.
Well, I'm old-fashioned, and I think I'm unmuted. I prefer a book. But when I go on the library website, almost everything is ebook. Sometimes I can't get what I want on a book. What happened to all the books? I mean, you see ebook, this, or it's always so many of them are now. You have no choice. You'd have to get out your Kindle or get out your whatever and read it off of there.
Or buy them. I mean, you can buy them.
Yeah, but I still prefer a book. And I don't know, one of these days, I guess I'll have to get with the times.
Anyone else want to share what's the platform of story experiencing they like the most? Cindy, please.
Okay.
I grew up listening to my great-grandmother tell the same handful of stories over and over and over and over again. And honestly, she was so old that my thought was always, this might be the last time I hear it. So I really want to pay attention. And she died last December. And I now hear those stories in her voice when I think of them. She had the same words, the same punchline, the same tone. And So for me, that's developed into really an appreciation of hearing people tell stories themselves, because I could write the words down for you verbatim for what she said, but it wouldn't be the same as the pauses and the inflection and all of that stuff that just changes meanings every now and then, in a way that I think just doesn't translate in any written form.
I saw that the Moth actually has published 2 or 3 volumes of stories collected from their podcast and radio show, and I have to think it's not the same as hearing them read. Yeah, Rich.
Oh, just for physical reasons, I prefer the ebook. I can control the light, the font. It's lighter, physically lighter to read it. If I'm traveling, I can bring a bunch of books along. Judy ought to try it. It really, really is easier. The problem is, you have to get accustomed to placing it on your gadget.
Right. Yeah, Peggy, please.
I'm with Judy. I prefer paper books, and I like National Geographic because I'm not good at reading history and retaining it, but I'm very good at it when I see it.
Mhm.
So I really enjoy National Geographic as a learning tool.
Great. David, and then Emma or Anthony.
I saw a production of Antigone Wednesday night. And I have read Antigone, I have taught Antigone, I know her personally. And the power of watching that unfold, even though I know exactly what's going to happen, even though I had and a different sort of like, oh, they're doing this differently. Oh, the messenger at the end is now Usmani. That sort of changes the meaning of that ending. When that's the person who runs in and tells what's going on. So I like to see the story enacted.
Mm-hmm. And Emma?
Well, storytelling is an important part of, we all have unique stories and experiences. And well, we've actually done storytelling at a sort of version of the Moth. There are a lot of venues now for doing that. Emma's done several, I've done a couple. Again, because it's a way of connecting with people that, well, they all have theirs too. And it rotates, people go through. That and paper books are the best. I don't want to become like a 10-year-old now where I just sit around and all day looking at the phone and.
Right. Well, I will say I don't read books on my phone. I have a special Kindle that looks more like paper, so I don't get my eyes as tired as I would reading a screen all day. Plus, so much of my life is on a screen these days that I don't need it when I'm reading. But I have to say my favorite format is actually the audiobook. I love listening to audiobooks, both nonfiction and fiction. Again, I think it's part of, I like to talk. I like to hear people talk. I learn auditorily. And some audiobooks, they actually get multiple voice actors to read it. So it becomes almost like a radio play, where if there's dialogue back and forth, you've got different voices speaking back and forth. You're like observing a conversation. And one of my favorite examples of this was, there's a beautiful book called The History of Love by Nicole Kraus, which is a few separate characters that have different chapters. And so the voice changes from chapter to chapter. And then near the end, they sort of come together in very short, like two or three sentence long chapters, and switches back and forth. But because it was done with different voice actors, it really sort of brought the climax of the book to a head, where you get the voice and you get the voice and they're getting closer together to each other, and it really came off perfectly. And the voice actors were terrific also, that helps. So I'm an audiobook person. If I had to pick a format, it would be listening to somebody read the book. So that's my personal preference. Yeah, Peggy, go ahead. You have to unmute though.
Oh, okay.
I remember, and I still like listening to the radio. when I was growing up, everybody sat around and listened to Inner Sanctum and all kinds of fun programs, and your imagination was so different when you would finally see them, like maybe 10 years later, and you think they don't look at all like I thought they would.
Mhm.
And there is a group that does live, they like reenact the radio, and they give these performances at some of the theater where they show, you know, clapping the shoes together or hitting on the desk or slamming doors. And it's really amazing how much imagination goes into all this.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, we tell the stories with the technology we have, or maybe we retell the stories in different ways. There's a theory going out there that there's only a certain number of stories and we're just recasting them in different ways. So there's one book that came out maybe 15 years ago that was called The 7 Basic Plots, which claims that there are really only 7 basic plots out there, and we are simply retelling them in different ways. So here I'm going to pull up a list of them. This comes from the Wikipedia summary, I will candidly admit. So one possible plot is overcoming the monster. The protagonist sets out to defeat an antagonistic force, often evil, which threatens the protagonist or the protagonist's homeland. And some examples of those stories are Perseus, Theseus, Beowulf, Dracula, War of the Worlds, The Seven Samurai, which was remade into The Magnificent Seven, James Bond, Jaws, Star Wars, and these could all fit into the category of overcoming the monster. Can you think of other famous stories that would fit in the overcoming the monster category?
Every Western.
Okay, got the Westerns, right?
Harry Potter series.
The Harry Potter series, for sure. Okay, so someone else? No, okay. So the next one was Rags to Riches. The poor protagonist acquires power, wealth, and or a mate, loses it all, and gains it back, growing as a person as a result. So examples for that would be Cinderella, Aladdin, Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, The Prince and the Pauper, The Ugly Duckling, The Gold Rush, The Jerk. Other examples of rags to riches are having it all and losing it and gaining it back.
The Wedding Singer.
The Wedding Singer. Well, a lot of romantic comedies actually have that. You find a partner and then you lose them, and then you either find a new one or you get them back, and you know that's a very common story arc, character arc.
The Blues Brothers.
Blues Brothers. There you go. The Quest. Speaking of Blues Brothers, they were on a mission from God. You have the Quest story. The protagonist and companion set out to acquire an important object or get to a location. They face temptations or other obstacles along the way, like Illinois Nazis. Examples include the Iliad, the Lord of the Rings, the Divine Comedy, Watership Down, the Aeneid, Raiders of the Lost Ark. They included Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I don't know that they actually saw that movie, but they were thinking of the Grail Quest as a quest. I don't know that that movie counts as a quest movie.
The Devil in the White City.
Yeah.
Devil in the White City. Okay.
Titanic.
Titanic. What's the quest in that? Oh, to find the ship.
Yeah, but they were all
Oh,
wanted,
define- no,
all wanted,
define.
that all of them wanted to get on.
Oh, onto the lifeboat.
Well, yeah, onto the lifeboat, and also to make a safe passage.
And to find love too.
Right.
And
Right.
they had plenty of obstacles along the way, right?
Yeah. A big white one.
Don Quixote.
Okay, Don Quixote is definitely on a quest. So another theme or possible narrative is the voyage and return. The protagonist goes to a strange land, and after overcoming the threats it poses or learning important lessons unique to that location, they return with experience. Examples could include The Odyssey, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Peter Rabbit, The Hobbit, Gone with the Wind, The Lion King, Back to the Future, Gulliver's Travels, Peter Pan, The Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, I might even think of Moses going up on the mountain, getting 10 commandments and coming back. You know, there's biblical versions of these too. Other examples of voyage and return stories.
Over the rainbow.
Right, The Wizard of Oz.
Apollo 13.
Apollo 13. Okay, great. Okay, those are the first four. The next one is a comedy, a light and humorous character with a happier, cheerful ending, or a dramatic work in which the central motif is triumph over adverse circumstance. It's a pattern where the conflict becomes more confusing, but is made plain in sort of a single clarifying event. Most romance films fit into this. So examples, they use a lot of Shakespeare: Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, Taming of the Shrew, Bridget Jones's Diary, Four Weddings and a Funeral, The Big Lebowski. I mean, I don't think we need to give examples of comedies. We know those. But there's also tragedies where the hero is a major character with a hero with a major character flaw, or a great mistake, which is ultimately their undoing. Their unfortunate end evokes pity at their folly and the fall of a fundamentally good character. So examples here include Bonnie and Clyde, Carmen, Citizen Kane, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, Madame Bovary, Romeo and Juliet, Hamilton, Great Gatsby. Other examples of tragedies with the character flaw or the one mistake that undermines everything, even when they're fundamentally good.
Moby Dick.
Moby Dick, right? The obsession with the whale.
Bonfire of the Vanities.
Okay. Yeah, we can all think of these. And then the
Iron
last,
Man.
I'm sorry?
Iron Man is eventually a tragedy.
Iron Man, okay. And then finally, a rebirth. An event forces the main character to change their ways and often become a better individual. So examples could be Pride and Prejudice, The Frog Prince, Beauty and the Beast, A Christmas Carol, Groundhog Day. You know, plenty of these stories of redemption and have to go through them. And by the way, many stories fit into multiple examples of this. You know, the idea of the sort of fall and return is like the rebirth. It's just a different framing of it. And you can also invert these stories. You know, one of the examples of the monster, what if the monster is the hero? You know, you think about King Kong, where it's really the monster isn't the monster, we're the monster. Or Frankenstein, where in fact, Frankenstein's monster is the most sort of sympathetic character in the story. I actually really like stories that challenge conventions. I like unreliable narrators. You know, that like the movie The Usual Suspects, where all of a sudden you have to reconsider everything when you find out something at the end. Or a multiple perspective narration, like Rashomon. Or backward storytelling, or backstories that fill in new pieces. I've been rewatching the TV show Lost, which was on in the mid-2000s. And it's a masterful job of filling in backstories for characters you already know, and now you get to know more about them by filling in what you didn't know before. Or another great example of this is Christopher Nolan's movie Memento, which is actually told backwards. It's like, you know, you go forward about 45 seconds and then go back 45 seconds before that, and then go back before that. And it really is mind-blowing when you sort of put all the pieces together.
I'll add to that,
yeah,
just as a plug, but also because it is magnificent. And that is fifth season has strong aspects of that, with the multiple perspectives, including, for those of us who like the book, a second person narration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One other example, somebody had mentioned they love how pictures are painted by authors. I love when you get a really creative perspective. Like there's a movie called The Red Violin, which is sort of the violin story going through history. Or there's a wonderful book called All the Light We Cannot See, where one of the main protagonists is blind. And when it's her story that's being told, you don't get any visual descriptions at all. You get sounds, you get textures, You get sort of temperatures, but he never describes anything visually when it's her story. And I thought it was brilliantly done. Maybe it was more obvious because I was listening to the audiobook of it, but it really struck me that was, again, very well done in storytelling from an unusual perspective. And so these are all characteristics of general storytelling. What would count to make something a Jewish story? After all, we've been talking about stories for a good piece of time and haven't used the word Jewish yet. So what would make a story into a Jewish story?
A lot of guilt.
Okay. That could make it a Catholic story too, you know.
Yeah.
We don't have the monopoly on guilt.
Some guilt.
Told by or about Jewish characters.
Okay, so Jewish characters might be a sort of a flag for that.
It has to include food.
Okay, but what if it's about Arabic food because they're Middle Eastern Jewish characters? Would that feel like a Jewish story for you?
Probably not.
You like Arabic food.
Yeah, that's Sephardic.
Yeah. It could be referencing Jewish sources, Bible stories, Talmud stories, whatever, recast in new directions. We'll see some examples of those. It could be, having an outsider's perspective on things. Some people see that as a hallmark of Jewish literature, or questioning authority. Maybe it's an audiobook or a storytelling. If I tell you a story and it sounds like this, then maybe you think that it's a Jewish character who's telling the story. There's something in the voice that would make a difference, even if you never say anything Jewish about them at all. I mean, this was one of the quirks of the show Seinfeld, where everyone assumed that all the characters were Jewish, but they never identify them that way at all. Many of the actors were Jewish, but nobody, it was not part of the plot of the story. Rhonda, were you going to jump in? No? Okay. Oh, Rhonda, were you trying to jump in? No? Okay. All right. So is having just a Jewish author enough to make it a Jewish story? I don't know. I think. Go ahead.
I don't think that because the author is Jewish, we kid about that. We say White Christmas is a Jewish song, but I don't really believe that. I don't think a story written by someone Jewish makes it a Jewish story. It's got to be, I think it's got to have a Jewish theme, Jewish people, Jewish historical events.
Okay. Well, then in theory, a non-Jewish person could write a Jewish story.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Snow in August.
So this is one of the complexities of talking about our favorite Jewish stories, where, what we might, and different people might identify different stories as Jewish or not Jewish based on tone and subject matter and so on. So what I want to do today is take a look at a story that everyone agrees is a Jewish story. It's not going to be a marginal case. And I want to take us through the story briefly. We'll talk about which of the 7 basic plots does it fit into, and then see some examples of retelling that story in different ways, in different media as well. So this is the beginning of the book of Genesis. It's the creation story. And this is actually the second creation story, because in Genesis chapter 1, you've got the 7-day version that ends with Shabbat, theoretically the day we're in now. This is the more mythological version, because you'll see in verse number 7, Yahweh the God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. God plants a garden and he puts the man there to tend it. Every tree that grows is pleasant to the sight and good for food, including 2 magical trees, the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so the man is put there to cultivate the garden, and he said, you can eat freely from every tree, but do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day you eat of it, you will surely die. And so then the God decides the man should have a helper comparable to him. He forms every animal of the field and brings him to the man, and the man gives them a name. Whatever he called it, that became its name. He causes the man to fall into a deep sleep because the animals aren't good enough. As he sleeps, one of the ribs is taken, and Yahweh the God makes a woman from the rib he taken from the man. And the man said, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She'll be called Isha, woman, because she was taken out of Ish, out of man. And therefore a man leaves his father and mother and joins with his wife, and they become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Remember, they're not allowed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In chapter 3, the serpent was more subtle, more clever than any animal of the field which Yahweh the God had made. The serpent said to the woman, "Has God really said you will not eat of any tree of the fruit of the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees of the garden, but not the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. God has said, you will not eat of it, you will not touch it, lest you die." The serpent said to the woman, "You won't really die. For God knows in the day you eat it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate it. She gave some to her husband and he ate it too. Their eyes were open and they both knew they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together, made coverings for themselves. They heard Yahweh's voice walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves in the presence of Yahweh the God from among the trees of the garden. And Yahweh called to the man and said, "Where are you?" The man said, "I heard your voice and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." "Who told you you were naked?" says God. "Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman gave to me, the one you gave to me. She gave me fruit from the tree and I ate it." And the woman says, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." And so then God curses the serpent and says, "You are cursed above all livestock. You crawl on your belly and eat dust the days of your life. You will attack their heels. They will bruise your head and you will have hatred between you and humanity." To the woman, he said, "I will multiply your pain in childbirth. You will bear children in pain. Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you."
Yeah.
And then Adam is cursed with, "You've listened to your wife's voice. You have eaten from the tree. Therefore, the ground is cursed for your sake. You will eat with it for much labor. You will eat bread by the sweat of your face until you return to the ground, for dust you are, and you shall return to dust." Yahweh the God made them garments of animal skins and clothed them. But now God says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out and take of the tree of life and eat and live forever, God sent him out from the garden. And he drove out the man and placed angels at the east of the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." So you've heard this story before, I imagine, in some version. Is this a good story, a bad story? What's good about it? What's bad about it? Did you notice anything different reading through it this detailed that you hadn't seen before?
Well, it doesn't make sense why God didn't know this was going on if he created the animal and the serpent and everything. It starts from the beginning. It doesn't make any good story. It doesn't make sense, so I don't think it's a good story.
There's a wonderful quote, I think it's by Mark Twain, where he said, "The difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to make sense." Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Who is us? When,
Right, let us do this.
well, he has become, look at man, he has become like us.
Right,
Who's us? Great question.
right. You might have noticed a subtle difference. In chapter 2, God tells Adam, "Don't eat from the tree of knowledge." But what does Eve say the rule is about the tree? God has said, "You shall not eat of it, you shall not touch it, lest you die." So maybe when Adam told her the rules, he added something to it by saying, "Don't even touch it." And maybe that was part of the downfall. Cindy, go ahead.
I find that the timing of you bringing this up a little funny, I guess. Yesterday, I saw a video of a woman talking about how women's bodies in particular, or women presenting bodies, are so very often sexualized all of the time. And she was talking about how for centuries and centuries, indigenous peoples wore clothing that was sort of reasonable for the climate they were in, and their bodies weren't necessarily shameful or sexualized in this. And it wasn't until colonizers from colder climates came and were like, oh, you're naked, you need to cover up, like, then it became a problem for them. And so this part, in this story about, they became aware that they were naked. It was like, things were fine until they made this decision to
To
do
create the
something that they were
concept.
told not to,
Or
basically.
to create the concept of being naked. That's one of our cultural hangups. But anyways, the other interesting thing about the story I find is sometimes you'll ask kids, what were Adam and Eve like before they ate from the tree? They walk around naked. They don't know if they're dressed or not. They don't know good from evil. They're like kids. They're like babies, And so part of the story is a coming of age story where we become fully human. We know good from evil. We have to work for a living, and we die, and we know that we die. The curse that God gives at the beginning, where He says, "If you eat from the tree, you'll die," that doesn't make any sense because they don't know what death is. What kind of a threat is that? But there's a lot of richness to the story. Biblical storytelling is different from what we're used to, right? There's no great painting of pictures here. We don't get an internal monologue of what people are thinking. We don't get extensive dialogue back and forth. It's very, very condensed. But sometimes there's those hints, like when Eve tells something different than what Adam was told. And that's an opening to maybe try to create a new story or speculate what might have happened in between those two places. Or when God says to Adam, "Where are you?" Now, maybe it's a God who is not all-knowing, or maybe it's a leading question. I know where you are, but where are you? And then, of course, Adam gives up the ghost. He admits what he wasn't supposed to do in his explanation for why he was missing. So this is, again, one of those founding stories in Jewish culture. And there are many ways you could retell it. In the Middle Ages, for example, the rabbis saw a difference between chapter 1 and chapter 2, where they actually invented another creation of another woman. They speculated that Adam's first wife was named Lilith, because Adam and Eve are created, or Adam and the woman are created at the same time in Genesis chapter 1, where there's this first and second order in Genesis chapter 2. So maybe there was an Adam and Lilith first, and Lilith demanded equality, which was unacceptable. And so then she became a demon, and she now seduces Adam in his sleep and causes nocturnal emissions, because they had to explain why those happen. And then Eve comes around in chapter 2, and we know the story from there. We've heard this story retold with the snake as Satan. If you think about John Milton's Paradise Lost, Christian mythology, which also has a Jewish source in the Second Temple Jewish literature that did not make it into the Bible. That's a retelling of this Genesis story too. So what I'm going to do is show you a couple of retellings. Because we're running a little long, if people are happy to stay, that's fine, but I'll do just one or two of them, and then we can go back to the third one at the end if anyone wants to stick around. This first one is actually a video retelling of the story. It's from a claymation movie that was made in 1985 called The Adventures of Mark Twain. And it's a retelling of his book called The Diary of Adam and Eve, where he sort of pictures Adam and Eve living near Niagara Falls and figuring out each other and how things are going to work. And you'll see he's made some interesting changes from the original story for different values and different objectives. This is only about a 12 or 13 minute clip from a longer piece. Hopefully you'll be able to follow it, and we will watch this version of the Adam and Eve story. So it's sort of an amusing retelling of the story. Were there any details that jumped out at you at that retelling that are worth highlighting, why they made certain choices?
Can you tell us when it was made?
1985.
Oh, okay. I was going to think much earlier.
Yeah, it's claymation. animation. Yeah, Bill and Peggy, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. I just see you on mute, so I don't know if you're playing. I mean, one detail I noticed this time I hadn't noticed before is when God pokes Adam to wake him up. It's not a clay motion hand, it's a physical human hand. Because in a claymation movie, the creator is are these. So I thought that was an interesting touch. I mean, she's the author, whoever it was, certainly changed the story, right? Eve is the one doing the naming. She's the sort of person in charge in many ways. The order is somewhat different. You know, they leave the garden first, and Adam eats the apple later, as opposed to before and then getting caught together. You know, I find it an interesting way to retell the story, imagining them as sort of keeping diaries, and she's a scientist who's investigating things, and she decides the animals are carnivores, and therefore eating the apple is a good thing if it brings death into the world. Yeah, Judy, go ahead.
I was kind of wondering where all those kids came from. I only heard about Cain, Abel, and Seth. I don't know. It's
Right.
like a lot of extra kids.
That's right. Although I did like how they depict Cain at the end, as the biker with a knife. That was sort of funny.
And one of them was a Cub Scout.
Right. Abel was the Boy Scout, right? He was the good kid. And actually, it does, in some of the scenes I cut out, it does show Abel being born as well. But yeah, it does say at the end of the story that they were, they had lots of grandkids. Seth has lots of kids, and obviously creates humanity. But yes, it is somewhat fanciful. And of course, like, he's reading a newspaper, he's playing cards, he answers the phone, the banana, like it's a phone. I mean, it's clearly not set in historic time, right? It's in an imaginary place. So another version of retelling this story with a similar kind of angle is in a poem. And it's a poem called Applesauce for Eve. So we're going to jump forward a little bit. This is a poem by Marge Piercy. Those old daddies cursed you and us in you, damned for your curiosity, for your sin was wanting knowledge, to try, to taste, to take into the body, into the brain, and turn each thing, each sign, each factoid round and round as new facets glint, and white fractures into colors, and the image breaks into crystal fragments that pierce the nerves, while the brain casts the chips into patterns. Each experiment sticks a finger deep in the pie, dares existence, blows a horn in the ear of belief, lets the nasty and difficult brats of real questions into the still air of the desiccated parlor of stasis. What we all know to be true, constant, melts like frost landscapes on a window in a jet of stream. How many last words in how many dead languages would translate into, but what happens if I, and whoops. We see Adam wagging his tail, good dog, while you and the snake shimmy up the tree, lab partners in a dance of will and hunger that thirst not of the flesh, but of the brain. Men always think women are wanting sex, cock, snake, when it's the world she's after. Then birth trauma for the first conceived kid of the ego. I think, therefore I am. I kick the tree. Who am I? Why am I going to die, die, die? You are indeed the mother of invention, the first scientist. Your name means life, finite, dynamic, swimming against the current of time, tasting, testing, eating knowledge like any other nutrient. We are all the children of your bright hunger. We are all the products of that first experiment. For if death was the worm in that apple, the seeds were freedom and the flowering of choice. And what Piercy has done there is taken that one line when it talks about the tree and it says, she saw the tree where the fruit was desired to make one wise. It would be good to eat from the tree. You see, if you recast the story with Eve as the heroine and God as the monster, who says, no, stay children, don't learn how to know good from evil. Don't discover the world. Don't grow up. That's the one doing something wrong. And the hero or the heroine is the one who breaks the rule for the sake of knowledge, and then who shares that knowledge with her partner. It changes the world. But I think it also makes us human and corrects an order that was wrong. So if you think about the story differently, it could be a different hero's journey than blaming them for violating the rules. You know, the traditional reading of that story is that it's only a tragedy. But it could be a challenging for the right. It could be a loss of homeland and a regaining of something else. Remember when Adam says in that claymation version, maybe it's better to be out here with her than it was to be in there without her. That's a kind of return or redemption that that wasn't part of the original story. So that's where retelling stories can do a lot of good. There are obviously a lot more Jewish stories that we could dive into. There's Joseph and his brothers, there's David and Bathsheba and his betrayal of Uriah the Hittite, which is beautifully written, even in biblical language. There's Esther and Mordecai. There's all kinds of stories about the rabbis as they try to manage their life and even argue with God at times. There's Tevye the milkman, the stories that become Fiddler on the Roof, and lots of stuff in between. Next week, in fact, I will be talking about another example of Jewish storytelling about telling stories. Everything is illuminated because the main character of the book, the person called the hero, is named Jonathan Safran Foer, the same name as the author of the book. So he's in his own book. And then he's writing the book and sending it to a character in the book who's giving him critiques on the books in the book, the chapters in the book. I mean, it's a wonderful version of this multi-layered story happening in modern times and in pre-modern times and jumping back and forth. What stories are told and what stories are not told. How does your perspective change how you understand things? There's a beautiful job of writing in a Russian kind of dialect that is particularly amusing if you know people who speak with Russian accents or who come from Russia. And it's when comedy and tragedy coexist, and those are the most meaningful stories. So I want to finish with one last Jewish story. It's a story by Shalom Aleichem, again, a story about telling stories. It's called A Yom Kippur Scandal. That's nothing, said the man in the bar. I've had much worse experiences than anything you've just told me. Let me tell you about the time when we had a special guest visit our synagogue on Yom Kippur. He walked into town just before the services began, and he made the most generous donation ever made to the synagogue, just for the right to have a prayer stand at the front of the congregation. And not only did he simply give the money to be part of the congregation, he prayed every minute of every service, all the way through from the evening service through the morning into the afternoon until the final service of Yom Kippur. And when the final service was concluded and we were wishing each other, Tekatevu v'techatemu, may you be written and may you be sealed in the book of life for the year to come, a great a cry came out from this man, and he said, "It's been stolen, it's been stolen." And we didn't know what he was talking about. And he revealed to us that he had been carrying with him a sack of money from his employer. He had no resources. His employer's money that he was responsible for, he had been carrying with him, and he didn't know what to do on Yom Kippur. He couldn't carry the money on Yom Kippur. And so he had hidden it in his prayer stand in the synagogue. And that's why he had never left, and why he had prayed and prayed and prayed. He didn't want to leave what was there, but somehow at one moment, when he had turned or bowed, or maybe when he laid himself flat on the floor, someone had stolen his employer's money. The rabbi cried out, "Lock the doors. No one shall leave this space until we find out who was the dastardly person who stole money on Yom Kippur of all days. Everyone must turn out their pockets." And the rabbi begins by turning out his, and they go to everyone, and finally they come to Yankel. And Yankel is known as a bit of a nevish, maybe he's suspect, and he says, "Why do you need to turn out my pockets? I'm a respectable person. There's no reason for you to turn out my pockets." And finally they pin his arms down, and they open his pockets, and what do they find? They find a few gnawed chicken bones, freshly wet, on Yom Kippur, the fast day of fast days. The man stops his story and takes another drink from his beer, and all of us around him said, "Well, and what happened to the money?" The man said, "Oh, that money was gone forever." That's the story. Sometimes you don't get an ending because life goes on and there are mysteries, and that's how it ends. That's another story by Shalom Aleichem, same author as the Tevye the Milkman stories. Well, I hope you enjoyed this journey through storytelling and why we tell stories, and also how that applies to Jewish stories and Jewish storytelling.